Freedom to Read Week is celebrating its 40th year. It's a movement that raises awareness about censorship and access to books and magazines, but it comes as a milestone around concerns over growing counter-movement and a surprise sharp rise in attempts to ban books in schools and libraries right across the country. The Waterloo Catholic District School Board temporarily banned Selma Writes a Book this past November. That's a children's novel about a young immigrant who grows up in Canada. Library officials, authors, teachers all say they are seeing more complaints and a jump in social media accounts that are dedicated to banning books. So joining us this morning from Toronto is Jim Turk, the director of the Centre for Free Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University. Welcome.
Good morning, Anne-Marie.
When we talk about banning books, especially in Canada, I'm always curious which titles are on the list. So according to Freedom to Read Week and your own organization, we've gathered some of them for people. Here they are. It's Perfectly Normal by Robbie H. Harris and Michael Emberley. All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. And the Canadian classic The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. What is it that people are objecting to in these books, Jim?
Well, different people are objecting to different things. Calls for book banning is just a continuation of a centuries-long process of people saying, well, the way to deal with things I don't like, that I find offensive, is to prevent anyone else from seeing them. I mean, it's a classic form of censorship, and we're seeing a significant increase in that recently. And the books that principally are targeted are children's books that are LGBTQ positive, or that talk about racism, or that talk about sex education. That seems to be the central focus, although there are many others, as some of the ones you showed.
Yeah, why do you think that there's an increase? Why the rise?
Well, I think it can be attributed in part to social media and our awareness of what's happening elsewhere. I mean, there's a really aggressive increase in demands for book bans in the United States. And it's being driven both in the United States and Canada in part by organized groups. The biggest one in the United States is one called Moms for Liberty, which is funded by some of the wealthy billionaires who fund Trump's campaign and are aggressively encouraging the governor of Florida and other governors to ban books in their states, in schools, in public libraries. And Canadian groups that are similarly minded see these examples of what's going on in the United States and say, geez, we can do that here. The biggest one in Canada is something called Action for Canada, which started out as an anti-masking, anti-vaxxer group, and now is sending out letters, notices of liability to school libraries and public libraries across the country saying, if you have any of these books on sex education in your library, then I can be charged under the criminal code with child pornography. Absolutely false. Yeah. So the social media is a big part in why we're seeing so much more of it.
I'm really glad you brought that up. In speaking with teachers and librarians over the past year and a half, they will say, yes, they've had an increase in complaints. So I'm curious then, how does the process work? Once somebody files a complaint, what does a school board or a library do?
Well, all libraries have selection criteria because they can't have every book, so they have a policy as to what they acquire and what they don't acquire. So when somebody challenges a book, the library looks at it and goes back and looks at its policy and decides whether in fact the book should be in the library according to its policy or not. Most of the time, they decide they should be in the library because they are pretty serious about following their own guidelines. And so they get back to the complainant and say, well, I'm sorry, this book meets our guidelines and it's going to remain in the library. Occasionally, they'll find that it was bought inappropriately, but most of the time they find that they've done a good job and they retain the book.
You've mentioned sometimes that libraries do get rid of a book. This happens in schools. We saw this in Peel region last year. This is in response to public pressure. Why do you and your organization believe it's important to review these complaints so carefully?
Well, the public has a right to object. I mean, part of freedom of expression is to say, I think this book is inappropriate. But libraries recognize the importance both for kids in schools and for the public of intellectual freedom, of the right to read, to hear, to get ideas so you can participate in public discourse. And what censorship is all about is somebody saying, well, because I find this book offensive, because I disagree with its ideas, you and nobody else in our society should have a right to read it, and you have to get it out of your library. And that just always undermines democracy. We do have things that are illegal in Canada, and libraries don't acquire those. But It's not up to individuals to say, well, although it's legal, I don't like it, and therefore you can't have it.
Yeah, people don't often think of a library when they think of something in terms of the front line or the frontline fight for democracy, but they are because of the expression, which is why we take this so seriously. Jim, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
My pleasure. Nice to talk with you.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this, be sure to subscribe here, or you can check out more Your Morning videos right here.